Evaluation of art is a tricky endeavor. Certain items naturally mean more to some people than others. When enough people declare a work to be of high artistic merit, or art, others tend to rally behind that declaration. Sometimes it's just a fad, and sometimes it endures long enough to be declared a classic by which all others should be judged. I feel like that's how high culture comes about. To borrow from an article by Sir Roger Scruton, high culture contains the works of art, literature, scholarship, and philosophy that establish a shared frame of reference among educated people. In other words, high culture consists of works that have become the standard by which future highly educated people use to evaluate art. I find that there's a certain air of elitism that tends to creep in with this evaluation of what is considered art. One of the points in this argument that I disagree with strongly is that the medium through which the piece came, or the subject of the piece, should have overriding determination on that value. For example, often we'll hear friends dismiss all animated films in this debate because, quote, they are made for children. While that is often true, not every animated film is made for a child audience, and there are plenty of animated films that are among the very best or most influential works that cinema has ever provided us. Should Snow White's impact on film be discredited or diminished because it is a fairy tale for children? I often think about Greek and Roman myths when I hear the conversation about animated films. A lot of the things that happened in those myths are no less preposterous than a princess who makes ice with her bare hands or a girl with obscenely long hair. And besides, weren't the myths of those heroes and gods meant to teach listeners about morality and about the world around them, much like animated Disney films do for our children today? I often see a similar method of dismissal with music. Newer genres and songs will always be inferior to the older material, right? Anything from today, like dubstep and pop rock and K-pop, will never be considered defining genres of music and will never produce pieces like Gustav Holst's The Planets or Joseph Haydn's Surprise Symphony. If this mentality has always been present throughout human history, why aren't tribal chants and Gregorian monk verses considered the apex of music? Mozart and Beethoven, often regarded as high culture today, received their criticism at the time, as did highly influential rock bands that we look upon fondly today, like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and Elvis Presley. During much of the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, William Shakespeare was overlooked by scholars in favor of other contemporaries of his, like Ben Jonson and John Fletcher. And yet, artists like Mozart, the Beatles, and Shakespeare have all endured over time, and many people afterwards have been inspired by this once regarded dreck that was pop culture. So, if I'm correct in assuming that time is usually a key factor before people come around to accepting new material as art, when do video games get to enter that conversation? Now, I'm not a moron. I know a lot of video games are simply made as products for a business, and most are never concerned with pushing the boundaries of the art in video games. However, I've certainly come across some games that rank amongst the best art I've ever seen from pop culture, and could eventually pave the way for future video games to break into high culture. I think arguments could be made that games like Nier Automata and The Walking Dead Season 1 stir as much thought-provoking commentary and emotion as literary classics like To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankenstein, or The Great Gatsby. In fact, the argument that video games are art is becoming more widely discussed amongst professionals. The Smithsonian Museum of Art launched an exhibit in 2012 featuring 80 games from the previous 40 years called The Art of Video Games. Of course, there will always be dissenters, and I invite people to continue this discussion, but put me squarely in the camp of video games are indeed an art form much like fine art, literature, or cinema. A different medium to be sure, and a relatively young one that has yet to reach its full potential, but it is art nevertheless. As I've said in the previous video, I think there is a difference between best and favorite, so this list will cover my 10 favorite games. Not necessarily the best video games, or the games that I feel are the best examples of art, though one or two of my favorite games should certainly be considered in that conversation. I've considered these games from a number of different perspectives, like my nostalgia with the games, my inherent likings towards certain genres, and replayability. But ultimately, I think I feel comfortable in saying these are the games I feel the most positive about. There are certainly some timeless classics that I've played that deserve their accolades, but this list is completely subjective, and thus some games won't be able to be represented despite how fantastic they are. Sorry, Mario. I also wanted to try doing this list in a somewhat different way. I'm gonna go by release year rather than by order on the list. Since I opened up the video with a rather lengthy bit about how video games are an emerging art form, I thought it might be interesting to look at my favorite video games through this lens and see how some build upon previous entries to make up my palette for video games. I'll certainly make it clear at the end of the video where these games land on a list, along with presenting a few runner-ups. So now, hopefully that people won't kill me for not putting on Metroid Prime, Skyrim, or The Last of Us here. Let's see how further wrong I can be about great video games, shall we? Spyro the Dragon wasn't the first video game that I played, but it is the first one that really got me interested in video gaming. I didn't own a Nintendo 64 until much later, and the original NES games I played were just a fun distraction. A simple collectathon with a colorful aesthetic and large worlds to explore about dragons sounded like a great time to a 5-year-old. I think I wore this game out, despite never actually beating the game. I was elated when the Reignited trilogy was released, and I knew I had to get it. I also have very fond memories of Year of the Dragon, but there's something about the simplicity of the original Spyro that's hard to beat. I loved exploring the worlds and finding every last gem. I felt prideful when I had mastered the supercharge ramps, and I was overwhelmed by the last 2 worlds in their tricky jumps and hordes of enemies, and yet I couldn't stop playing it. It's probably the easiest game on this list, and it's certainly the one I can beat in the fastest amount of time, but when I think of my history of video games, it usually begins with Spyro. Now, just because I didn't own an N64 until 2001, that doesn't mean I was blind to that excellent console. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask are my first exposures to The Legend of Zelda. I've not played the whole series, but each game I have played, I've enjoyed immensely. Gamers will always cite it as an impossible task to pick which of the 2 games is better, but I think I slightly prefer Ocarina, due to its charming childlike sense of wonder and for breaking the mold with 3D action games. Ocarina is really just an evolution of A Link to the Past, but more games cite Ocarina as their inspiration. It's always struck me as a perfectly paced game, with each location being memorable, dozens of things to track down, ingenious uses of items to solve puzzles, and just a wonderful general sense of freedom. I really can't go too hard against the grain here. Plenty of people love this game and have articulated far better than I can why it's great. Just know I share the same opinion as the masses on this one. There are a few games I like more, but few are as foundational to the industry and my own enjoyment of video games as Ocarina. During the summer of 2000, the icebreaker on the elementary school playground was, which version do you have? We didn't need clarification. We all had access to a Game Boy and we all had Pokemon. I owned Red version first, in one of the monstrous original Game Boys, but Gold version was my jam. My older sibling owned Silver version, and so we could work off of each other in our quests. The original Pokemon games were masterfully simple in their core gameplay, but so addicting that it was easy to spend hours on your quest. It's such a wish fulfillment kind of game. Travel all over the world, capture and train your team, battle against friends and rivals, and prove yourself as a person. Gold and Silver also had the benefit of more features. An expanded roster, twice as many gyms to conquer, the onboard clock which would determine some aspects of the game, a rudimentary fast travel system or 2 in place, and the ability to re-battle trainers. It really was the great adventure I couldn't have as a 7-year-old. It made the long car trips and school bus rides a breeze, and I still love getting lost in those worlds. I've never really been able to get into real-time strategy games, so I'm surprised how much this one keeps coming back in my rotation. Playing out a version of the Cold War with fantastic concepts like mind control, prism tanks, mirage tanks, and easy-to-build nuclear missiles, this game is just chaos galore for an armchair general. I love how simple it is to grasp the benefits of each unit and team, and there's an infinite amount of fun to be had in figuring out new tactics and strategies. I also have to give a shout out to its expansion, Yuri's Revenge, which features some fantastic new additions. The music in the game is also quite catchy. I've spent a lot of time in the skirmish modes where you create your own battles, but there are a number of great single-player missions in both campaigns, like Tanya destroying 2 nuclear missiles with a handful of spies, hunting down the president in San Antonio with a few mind control units, and using a team of Navy SEALs to take down a base in Central America. This would probably be my pick for a game that most deserves a re-release or remaster these days. Remember that point I made in the beginning about animated adventures often being written off as just for kids? I thought the same way about this game. I was initially turned off by the cel-shaded style, like most everybody I've ever talked to about it. However, I still wanted to try it as every reviewer was giving it amazing scores. The GameCube housed so many wonderful childhood-defining games for me, but the Wind Waker stands tall above them all. Unlike Ocarina of Time, I was the first member in my family to play through this adventure, and thus it endears itself more to me than any other Zelda title I've played since. I had to figure out the dungeons and the puzzles on my own, and thus came a sense of ownership about this game. I don't know how to describe the game other than as my game. The Wind Waker was my game, and I will always stand by it. It's a moving adventure with all of its characters, including Link, having a personality. It features my favorite musical score of the series, I never get tired of the seafaring, and I still get a kick out of several moments of humor and heart that are in this one. This is one of my favorite adventure games of all time, and I highly recommend for everyone to get over their prejudices and try this out for yourself. Anyone who knows me personally knows how big of a fan I am of Star Wars, and thus it's no surprise that at least one game from that franchise should show up here. As much as I love and admire the original KOTOR, this one just beats it out in most every category by a hair or two. I've written quite a bit about this one in my Star Wars video games ranking, and so I'll try to keep this brief. To quote myself, the story's not only better than the original, it changed my view on Star Wars itself. Thanks in large part to Kreia, who in my opinion is the best video game character that Star Wars has ever had, the game's exploration of themes like gray morality, how different the Jedi and Sith are really, the people's perception of Jedi and the Force, the cost of war both large and small, and what true hope is, makes this the most narratively rich game of the series. There are other reasons I love this game, and I do have a few complaints with it, but I really can't leave this game off if I'm being honest with myself. Because I was a big fan of Knights of the Old Republic, I certainly was aware of the Mass Effect series soon afterwards, but I didn't actually get around to them until about 2018. My wife found a copy of Mass Effect 2 for $1 on one of our dates, and I just couldn't resist. I do wish I had played the first game prior to that purchase, as it was hard to go back to Mass Effect 1 after having experienced the sequel. Still, I was absolutely invested in the plight of Commander Shepard for this one. The mystery about the collectors and how they tie into the Reapers is interesting, but it's the characters on your crew that make this adventure worth having. Most of the game is about them, and my goodness, this is my favorite ensemble of characters I've ever played with in a game. The reason that final suicide mission is often cited as the best final level in any game is because you are in charge of the safety of your crew, and whether they live or die and continue on into the next chapter of the story depend on your leadership style and choices. I was absolutely devastated when I lost some of them, and thus I eagerly played through the game again to ensure their survival. I went through another 20 hours of this adventure just because I wanted to save the 3 crew members that I lost. That's the power of video games as an art form. You don't have the same interactivity with the story or characters in a novel or film, and thus their fates feel somewhat definitive and unmotivated by you. In a video game where your choices affect their fates, their deaths or survivals hit so much harder than anything else. What in your life has prepared you for the time when you have to decide what happens to your treasured friends? That's pretty good stuff from a video game. I could have included the trilogy as a whole because it's one massive story, but because I'm doing singular entries, Mass Effect 2 is my pick from that trilogy. The Portal series was very much an impulse purchase from me. They were available on a digital sale, and I knew their reputation from online reviewers. A puzzle game with a good sense of humor seems right up my alley, and so it was to no surprise that I grew to be a fan of Portal as well. While the first one is just as good as the sequel, I marginally prefer this one because I think it's a little bit funnier, it's a bit longer, and it has a fantastic co-op experience. The real MVP of the game is the character actor Stephen Merchant. He's great and wonderful as Wheatley. He starts off as a companion and then becomes a much larger and more involved part of the story in the second half. He instantly cemented himself as one of my favorite video game characters. My wife and I watch a lot of TV shows together, and after this game, it was always a joy when Merchant pops up in things like The Big Bang Theory, The Good Place, and Modern Family. This game is a lot like the original Spyro for me. It's a charming game that doesn't take too long to complete. Portal 2 comes with a high recommendation from me for any gamer, regardless of what they like. I got The Dark Knight for Christmas in 2008 on DVD, and before the movie, there was a trailer on the disc for a forthcoming game called Arkham Asylum. I became intrigued and kept my eye on it. And when it came out, I got it pretty close to launch day. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it quickly became my favorite version of that character. When Arkham City was announced, I couldn't be more excited. I got my hands on that pretty quickly as well, and I couldn't put it down. The story is one of my very favorite Batman tales in any medium. There's not a weak link in the voice cast, and every character is absolutely true to their comic book counterparts. On top of that, the combination of gameplay systems is one of my favorites in any video game. The expansions on both the free flow combat and Invisible Predator are very much welcome. The side stories also feel fairly fleshed out and give great tastes as to the larger universe of Arkham. And the Easter eggs are also very clever, such as the painting at the beginning and how it mirrors the ending of the game. I like Arkham Origins and Arkham Knight quite a bit as well, but City beats them pretty soundly. This is one of the few games I've 100%ed at least twice, and I've had a blast every time I replay the game. It's certainly one of my very favorite video games, and I can't wait for the next time I get to plunge my hands into the filth of Gotham with The Dark Knight. I've been a fan of the Assassin's Creed series from the very first game, and I've immensely enjoyed the stories of Ezio and Altair and Cassandra from other games in the series, but Black Flag remains my favorite. Like KOTOR 2, I've already gone into depth about my feelings about this one in another video, so I'll just try to summarize here. I feel like the classic style of Assassin's Creed gameplay peaked with this adventure, and if you were sick of that, there was a fantastic pirate adventure left over. I've gotten lost for hours just sailing the sea, pillaging other nearby ships, and upgrading my own vessel. It's a rewarding gameplay loop that you don't often see. I also feel the story is a fine one about reflection on your own beliefs and goals, though it's not quite the best historical narrative that the series offers. The side characters are also really memorable and stick with you long after the game is over. Plus, it's set in one of my favorite eras of history, the Golden Age of piracy. In a lot of ways, this game captures some of the same feelings I had with The Wind Waker, and thus I just bask in the chance to return to this game about every year or so. Those are the 10 games that make up my favorite video games of all time. I promised to list a few runner-ups, and I've already talked about a few, like Knights of the Old Republic, Portal, and Majora's Mask. So here are just a few more that didn't quite make the cut. Now, I really like the original Gears of War as well, but Gears 2 has a better story, more engrossing environments, it actually answers some questions about the Locust, and features one of the most emotional scenes I've ever seen in a video game. I don't often talk about multiplayer in video games because they rarely factor into my appreciation of the game overall, but this is a major exception. It feels like it was made for co-op. It kind of feels wrong not to play it with a buddy. Horde mode is also a great time for parties. This is probably my favorite third-person shooter next to the Mass Effect series. Halo has never quite grabbed me as a series, probably because I don't do online multiplayer, but even I'm not immune to the greatness of Halo 2. I love the switch off between Master Chief and the Arbiter. The opening levels on New Mombasa are spectacular. The writing helps to make for a solid science fiction universe, and this is yet another great co-op experience. Plus, how do you not get chills from Marty O'Donnell's theme? The Call of Duty series is a controversial one, and I too have some mixed feelings about the series overall. But I do return to some of the earlier games pretty regularly, and my favorite is Modern Warfare 2 from 2009. It takes the solid foundation built upon by the first game and amps it up greatly. Every level is a blast to play, the voice cast is really solid, and this was the last time before the reboot of Modern Warfare that I feel like the creators had a handle on how to tell a story with effective pacing, rather than constant action all the way through. The Spec Ops mode is also a great time with a friend, and features some unique scenarios that are worth trying out. This is probably my favorite first-person shooters, as the controls are really tight. And this is another one that is a short but great blast to play through. I agonized for a little while whether this entry should be on my list. Just on a pure enjoyment level, it probably should, and it's so close to edging out another game on this list. It's my favorite Jedi action game. It's got a wonderful presentation of the traditional hero's journey. I love the customization. All the worlds have something that's deliciously intriguing about them, and I was surprised how much the game ticked off my own personal boxes of what I like in video games. Like Portal 2, I've returned to it far more often than I expected to, and that's really got to count for something. Of the lists that I've done, this was the hardest one to put together, as there were many games I agonized about not including. There are favorite franchises of mine that don't get represented in any way on this list, like Tomb Raider, the Telltale series, or James Bond. I wonder if putting together a top 10 list of video games was difficult for any of you. Are your choices baked in nostalgia, like Spyro the Dragon is for me? Or are they kind of all-time greats like Ocarina of Time? Do they have a heavy multiplayer emphasis like Modern Warfare 2? Or are they primarily ones that put forth a great single-player campaign like Mass Effect 2? Video games are the fastest growing section of entertainment, and I think we've got plenty more instant classics in the pipeline just waiting to come forward and wow us all.